Today we're diving into a 3,000-year-old guide for making things right. And what we found, well, it's a surprisingly sophisticated and honestly, a really humane system for how to handle our mistakes.
You know the feeling, right? We've all been there. You make a mistake, you break a rule, maybe you hurt someone, but you didn't even realize you were doing it. So what's the right way to handle that? It's a question we still wrestle with today, but it turns out an ancient society had a very specific and pretty fascinating answer. So, we're digging into the legal and spiritual code of the ancient Israelites. And you can tell they thought about this a lot, this whole problem of unintentional wrongs. They actually developed a really detailed process for dealing with guilt, even when you weren't aware of it at first. Now, their solution wasn't just, saying, "my bad," and moving on. It was a formal system of ritual offerings, and they were all designed to bring about something they called atonement. The whole goal was to restore relationships that were broken, both with the community and with the divine, even when that break was completely accidental. Okay, so let's break this down. The first major category in their system was something called the sin offering. And this was designed specifically for those moments when it suddenly dawns on you after the fact that you've messed up.
So what kind of mistakes are we talking about here? The text lays out a few specific examples. First, imagine there's a public call for witnesses to a crime, and you saw something, but you failed to testify. That's one. Second, if you accidentally touched something that was considered ritually impure, like a dead animal. Or third, if you just made a careless promise, a thoughtless oath without really thinking it through. In any of these cases, the second you realize what you did, the process begins. And this part right here is absolutely crucial. Before any ritual or any offering could happen, the person had to take responsibility. They had to actually confess the specific thing they did wrong. Accountability was totally non-negotiable. It was the starting line for making things right. So, what was the end goal of all this? Atonement. And you gotta understand, this wasn't really about punishment. It was about repair. The entire system was built to give a person a path to make amends, to achieve reconciliation, and to be brought back into a right relationship with everyone. Now, here's where this ancient system gets really, really interesting. It was designed from the ground up to be accessible to everybody, no matter how much money you had. It's got this surprising element of social justice built right into it. Get this, the law laid out a sliding scale for the offering. If you could afford it, the standard was a female lamb or a goat. But if you couldn't, the requirement changed. You could bring 2 birds instead. And if even that was too much of a stretch, a simple offering of fine flour was accepted. And the text itself is incredibly explicit about this. It spells it right out, making sure that poverty was never a barrier to being forgiven and making things right. I mean, think about that. It's a powerful statement that access to justice and reconciliation shouldn't depend on how wealthy you are. The rituals themselves were, deeply physical and symbolic. In the case of the 2 doves, for example, the priest had to perform a very specific set of actions. Each one of these steps was a visible, tangible representation of the atonement process actually happening right there in front of you. All right, let's move to the second major category, which kind of builds on these ideas. It's called the guilt offering. And this one was reserved for a totally different type of unintentional mistake, one that involved sacred items or duties. This offering was for when someone, again, totally by accident, mishandled something that was dedicated to God, like a sacred offering, or maybe they just unknowingly broke one of the divine commands. The moment they found out about their error, this different and frankly more serious process kicked in. So, what's the real difference between these two? Well, the sin offering dealt with more personal, kind of everyday mistakes and impurities. The guilt offering, on the other hand, was for violations against sacred things, and that led to a critical difference. The sin offering was all about forgiveness. The guilt offering, that demanded both forgiveness and restitution. And that's the key word right there, restitution. It was a total game changer. It wasn't enough to just perform a ritual. If your mistake caused a real, tangible loss to the sacred domain, you had to pay it back. You had to restore what was lost. And the law was incredibly specific about this. You didn't just have to make full restitution for the value of whatever you violated, you also had to add an extra 20% on top of it. This financial penalty was a tangible way of saying, hey, this was a serious offense. Okay, so when we step back and look at this whole system, the sin offering, the guilt offering, that amazing sliding scale, the restitution, what does it actually tell us about the values of this ancient society? What did they really care about? Well, a few core principles just jump right out. First, accountability is everything. Even honest mistakes have consequences. Second, restitution is key. Making things right often requires more than just words. Third, justice has to be accessible to all, not just the rich. And finally, and maybe most importantly, forgiveness is always possible. There's a clear, defined path to getting back to a good place.
So it leaves us with a pretty deep question, doesn't it? In our own world, where we often struggle with accountability and forgiveness, what can we really learn from this ancient, incredibly detailed blueprint for how to make things right?